The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the dust settle. Every eye was locked on the man who had just entered. A full-bird colonel, his dress uniform a declaration of authority. He walked with a purpose that silenced every whisper, his gaze fixed on me and me alone. The opposition's lawyer, a man named Peterson, stood frozen, his smug expression melting into slack-jawed disbelief. The colonel stopped 3 feet from my table, snapped to attention, and rendered a salute so sharp it cracked the silence. It wasn't for the judge. It was for me. But 30 minutes earlier, that same silence had been my enemy. I was on the stand, a defendant in a case brought by my own mother. My mother, Eleanor Sterling, a woman obsessed with social status, believed my quiet, secretive military career was a footnote compared to my late father's heroic legacy. She had initiated a competency hearing, arguing that my desk job had left me with debilitating anxiety, that I was unstable. She wanted control of my finances, and more than that, she wanted control of my story. Her lawyer, Peterson, a man who fed on weakness, leaned in close, his voice dripping with condescension. "Major Sterling," he began, letting the title hang in the air like an accusation. "You claim your service was demanding." He gestured toward my hands, which rested on my lap. I felt 100 pairs of eyes focus on the slight, persistent tremor I could never fully control. It was a part of me, a cost I had paid long ago, in a dark room, thousands of miles from home. "The jury can see it," he announced, his voice rising with theatrical confidence. "No soldier, no officer, would shake like that from just pushing paper." The room buzzed with whispers. The lawyer laughed, a short, ugly sound of victory. I glanced at my mother in the front row. She wasn't looking at me with support, but down at her lap, her posture a perfect performance of shame. For a moment the courtroom faded, and all I could see was every dismissive comment. Every time, she called my job a hobby, every comparison to my father that I was never meant to live up to. This hearing wasn't a beginning. It was the culmination of a lifetime of being invisible. My mother saw a broken daughter. Her lawyer saw a liability. Neither of them understood that those hands, the ones they were mocking, had signed off on operations that shaped global events. To understand why a full-bird colonel would render honors to me in a civilian courtroom, you have to understand the war I fought at home and the one I fought in the shadows. To my family, my life was a portrait hanging crooked on the wall. At every holiday, my mother would stand by the fireplace mantel, gesturing to the 2 frames that told her story of our family's service. One was a large, professionally shot photo of my father in his infantry dress uniform, his chest heavy with medals, his gaze heroic. And next to it was a small 5x7 of me, squinting in the sun on graduation day from basic training. It was the only picture she had of me in uniform. She saw it as a starting point I never moved past. I remember one Christmas, a family friend asked what I did in the Air Force. Before I could answer, my mother stepped in, her voice light and airy. "Oh, Anna works in logistics, I believe, all behind a screen." She'd pat my arm. "Safe, at least." The word hung in the air, a quiet judgment. Safe meant unimportant. Safe meant I wasn't my father. I would just smile, a tight, practiced expression that betrayed none of the cold fury I felt inside. She had no idea that safe behind a screen meant staring at satellite feeds. For 36 hours straight, praying a drone pilot's timing was perfect. The dismissals were constant, small paper cuts that added up over the years. When I was awarded a Joint Service Commendation Medal, the citation was almost entirely blacked out with redactions. I tried to show it to her, hoping for a flicker of pride. She held the frame for a moment, tracing the redacted lines with her finger, and said, "Well, that's nice, dear. I'm sure it's one of those things they give everyone for participation." The memory stung just as much as the time she'd given away my childhood astronomy. Telescope. Because my cousin showed a real aptitude for science. It was always the same story. My accomplishments were placeholders, never the main event. And then there was the tremor. It became her favorite piece of evidence for my supposed fragility. "You should see someone about that anxiety, dear," she'd say over dinner, her voice laced with a sweet, patronizing concern. "It just doesn't look professional." She saw it as a weakness, a crack in the porcelain image she wanted for a daughter. She never once considered that it wasn't a sign of anxiety, but the physical echo of a choice I had to make. A choice that still haunted me in the quiet hours of the night. It wasn't a failure to live up to my father's legacy. It was the price of my own. But then there was my other world. The real one. It existed in a windowless room deep underground, a place officially known as a sensitive, compartmented information facility. The only light came from dozens of glowing screens, and the only sound was the quiet hum of servers processing trillions of bits of data per second. In that room, I wasn't a disappointment. I was a lead analyst for the Defense Intelligence Agency. In that room, my mind was a weapon. The tremor in my hands didn't matter when my fingers were flying across a keyboard, connecting dots no one else could see. My commanding officer was Colonel Miller, a grizzled but brilliant man who saw the world in patterns others missed, and who trusted my instincts more than his own. One night, the hum of the room was shattered by a flashing red alert. I brought a signal intercept up on the main screen, my heart pounding a steady, controlled rhythm. I pointed to a data packet that looked like meaningless noise to anyone else. "Sir," my voice was low, cutting through the tension. "The chatter from the Black Sea station. It's showing a pattern consistent with the Ghost Echo protocol. Our asset is compromised." Colonel Miller stood behind me, his eyes locked on the screen, the silence stretching for an eternity. The life of an agent, a human being out in the cold, was hanging on my analysis. "If we don't trigger an exfil within the next hour," I said, my voice unwavering, "we lose them." He didn't hesitate. He didn't second-guess me. He just looked at me and gave the order that changed everything. "Execute," he said. "On your authority." For 10 years, I had built a wall between my worlds. I let my mother believe I was a disappointment because it was easier than explaining a truth she wasn't cleared to hear. But when she used that lie to try and strip me of my autonomy in a court of law, she didn't just attack her daughter. She unknowingly challenged my command authority, and the system I serve has a protocol for that. After the initial hearing was scheduled, a heavy sense of futility settled over me. For years, I had tried to fight my mother's narrative with reason, with emotion, with pleas to be seen for who I truly was. Every attempt had been like throwing stones against a fortress wall. I realized then that fighting this battle on her terms, in the messy, emotional world of our family, was a battle I was guaranteed to lose. Her story was simple and compelling, a worried mother and a broken daughter. Mine was a labyrinth of classified truths she had no clearance to understand. The turning point came when her lawyer, Peterson, filed a motion to subpoena my full, unredacted service record. He was on a fishing expedition, convinced he'd find a trove of medical reports and psychological evaluations to prove I was unfit. My own lawyer was frantic, insisting we fight it at all costs. "We can't let them see that file, Anna," he'd urged. But as he spoke, a new kind of clarity cut through my frustration. A cold, quiet strategy began to form in my mind. "No," I told him, my voice perfectly level. "We're going to approve it. But we're going to add a condition." I took the legal pad from his desk and drafted the clause myself. My handwriting was steady as I wrote that due to the highly classified nature of the document, its transfer to a civilian court would require an official military courier of rank 06, a colonel, or higher. This was not just to ensure a secure chain of custody, but to have an officer present, who could provide a formal attestation of service if the judge required it. It was a Trojan horse, disguised as a security protocol. Next, I made one secure call to Colonel Miller's office. I didn't ask for a favor or plead my case. I spoke in the precise, formal language of regulations. I informed his aide that my service record was subject to a civilian court order, and as per procedure, I was notifying my former commanding officer. I stated that I had filed a procedural request for an O6 escort to ensure proper handling of classified materials. The JAG office approved it within an hour. To Peterson and my mother, this must have looked like a desperate, last-ditch gambit. Calling in a character witness who they were sure would be forced to admit the truth about my instability. They celebrated when my counsel agreed to their motion. They thought they were prying open a sealed box of my secrets. They had no idea I was the one who had handed them the key, knowing they were about to walk into a room where they didn't understand the rules. We were back in the courtroom, and the air was thick with a verdict already rendered. Peterson had just finished his closing remarks, a masterful performance of condescending theater. He had painted a picture of me as a fragile, anxious woman playing dress-up in a uniform she hadn't earned. I could see it on the jury's faces. They believed him. My mother, sitting in the front row, wore an expression of profound, pitying victory. It was the look of someone who had done something difficult for my own good. The judge looked down at his notes, ready to move things along, ready to sign the papers that would strip me of my independence. And then, the heavy oak doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The sound echoed in the silent room, and every head turned. It was Colonel Miller. He wasn't just in uniform. He was in his Class A's, the formal attire reserved for the most serious of occasions. His chest was a testament to a career spent in the shadows and on the front lines. The Defense Superior Service, Medal, the Legion of Merit, ribbons I knew were from operations that would never be declassified. He walked with a quiet, undeniable gravity, his footsteps measured and silent on the marble floor. He didn't look at the judge. He didn't look at the jury. His eyes found mine and held them. He walked past the plaintiff's table, past my mother, who stared at him in confusion. He stopped 3 feet in front of me, his posture ramrod straight. Then, he raised his hand in a salute so crisp, so perfect, it seemed to vibrate in the air. The sound of his hand meeting his brow was the only noise in the universe. The judge, visibly startled, leaned forward into his microphone. "Colonel," he said, his voice tight with confusion, "your testimony is for the court." Colonel Miller lowered his hand but didn't break his gaze from me. He turned his head slightly toward the bench. "My apologies, Your Honor." His voice was calm, but it carried an authority that filled the room. Protocol dictates. I first acknowledged the ranking field officer in the room. He gave a short, subtle nod in my direction. Peterson let out a disbelieving scoff. "Ranking officer? She's a major." My mother shook her head slightly, as if this was all just some bizarre, embarrassing mistake. That's when the colonel's voice turned to ice. "Counselor," he said, addressing Peterson directly for the first time. Major Sterling was the lead intelligence director for Joint Task Force Ares. In that capacity, she held mission command authority over assets, including my own field personnel. He paused, letting the words sink into the stunned silence. In the theater operations, her authority often superseded my rank. I watched my mother's face as she tried to process the sentence. Superseded his rank. The concept was so alien to her rigid worldview of command and legacy that she looked broken. "I am here today," the colonel finished, his voice like stone, under her authority. The judge sat back. His entire demeanor changed. He looked from the colonel to me, then back again. "Colonel," he said, his voice now laced with a deep, newfound respect. Regarding the defendant's service record, and the tremor in her hands, Peterson leaned forward, a last flicker of hope on his face, believing this was where his case would be proven. He was wrong. Miller's gaze was unwavering. "Your Honor," Major Sterling's complete service record is sealed under the Intelligence Identities Protection Act of 1982. Its contents cannot be entered into a civilian court. Peterson's face fell. However, the colonel continued, I am authorized to state for the record that the condition in her hands is a medically documented neurological symptom. It is a direct result of overexposure to high-stress signals decryption during Operation Midnight Sun. He scanned the faces of the jury, ensuring each one of them understood the weight of his next words. That tremor, you see, is the physical cost of a strategic victory that saved this country from a catastrophic cyber attack. It is not a mark of weakness. His eyes finally landed on my mother, and his voice dropped to a low, powerful growl. It is the scar from a battle no one in this room, myself included, was cleared to watch her fight. The silence in the room was absolute. My mother had built her entire case on the idea that my service wasn't real. In the end, it was so real it couldn't even be spoken about in a court of law. After the colonel's last word fell, the silence in the courtroom was a living thing. It was heavier than judgment, more final than a gavel. The judge, a man who had looked at me with professional skepticism just an hour before, cleared his throat. He looked directly at me, and his voice was filled with a gravity I hadn't heard before. Major Sterling, he said, this competency hearing is dismissed with prejudice. He then looked to my mother and her lawyer. And I believe this court owes the Major an apology for what she has been subjected to today. Peterson just sat there, his face pale, his entire case demolished by a truth he never could have anticipated. As the bailiff called the court to a close, a flurry of movement began. But through it all, I saw only one person, my mother. She rose from her seat, her face a mess of confusion, shame, and a dawning horror. She took a hesitant step toward me, her hand outstretched. Anna, she whispered, her voice cracking. I didn't know. But the words trailed off into the noise of the room. For a lifetime, those were the words I had longed to hear. I didn't know. An admission of the vast, secret world I inhabited that she had never bothered to see. But hearing them now, I felt nothing. Colonel Miller placed a steadying hand on my shoulder, and together we turned and walked away. I didn't look back. I was leaving that world behind, flanked by the only family that mattered now, one built on mutual respect, not broken obligation. 9 months later, I stood in a different kind of room. It was a lecture hall at the National Intelligence University, filled with the bright, focused faces of the next generation of intelligence officers. The oak lectern felt solid under my hands, and on my uniform, silver oak leaves had replaced the gold. The promotion to lieutenant colonel had come with a new mission: to teach, to pass on the lessons learned in silence. The tremor in my hands was still there, a quiet, constant companion. I decided it was time to introduce it. I held my hands up for the class to see, letting the slight, persistent shake become a part of the lesson. This, I began, my voice calm and strong, carrying to the back of the hall. This is the result of 13 straight hours, directing signals intelligence, to prevent a network breach that would have cost lives. It is a neurological signature, a receipt for a service rendered. I met their eyes one by one. Some scars are visible. The most important ones are earned in silence. Your job, when it is your turn, will be to carry them with honor. After the lecture, I was surrounded, not by lawyers and accusers, but by eager students with sharp questions, and by fellow instructors who were my peers in every sense of the word. We didn't talk about family drama or perceived weaknesses. We talked about geopolitical strategy, about emerging threats, about the complex, silent work of keeping people safe. One of my colleagues, a former field agent, clapped me on the shoulder. Great lecture, Anna. You made the theory real for them. In that simple moment of camaraderie, I felt more at home than I ever had at my mother's dinner table. This was my community now. That evening, in the quiet of my apartment, my phone buzzed. It was a text from a number I hadn't seen in months. It was my mother. I read the message on the screen. "Your father would have been proud." "I am. Can we please talk?" 10 years ago, that message would have been a lifeline. 5 years ago, it would have made me weep with relief. But now, I felt only a distant, quiet pang of closure. I thought of the young officers I was now responsible for, of the important work that lay ahead. My worth was not a question waiting for her to answer. It was a fact, proven in rooms she would never see and validated by people she would never meet. I held my finger over the screen for a moment, then simply archived the message. I didn't need to reply. I had a lecture to prepare for the next day. My family wanted me to inherit a legacy defined by a name on a memorial wall. I chose to build one defined by the lives I protected and the silent battles I won. If you've ever had to prove your worth to people who refuse to see it, share your story in the comments below. In this community, your quiet victories are always recognized.